Hello, Restoration Church. It's Pastor Kurt, and I'm so glad that you are tuning in today, wherever you're watching us from. Thanks for allowing us to be a part of your spiritual journey and walking with us through this conversation that we began last week called The Gift of Disillusion, looking at the life of Joseph and asking some important questions about how they apply to our life and the current state that many of us find ourselves in 3 months into quarantine, when the world feels crazier than ever and we might feel more alone than ever, and we are faced with the realities of the disillusion that we might have experienced or that are experiencing, and watching it set in as plans have changed, dreams have subsided, things that we thought we could count on were no longer certain. Graduations are now digital or socially distant, and all the things that we are facing together in this time really can bring up within our soul some really profound questions. And so the thing that we've kind of been wrestling with together, and the reason we have this series, is to ask the question, is there actually a gift in the midst of that disillusion that God has for you? Perhaps in the midst of something challenging, something hard, something that we wouldn't have asked for, something that we weren't maybe even prepared for, is there something that God has waiting and in store for us that we will be better because of it on the other side? And as we look to the story of Joseph in the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, his life navigates through all kinds of different seasons. Many that he did not choose, some that were challenging, some that were extraordinary, and some that were downright painful and disappointing. And so as we've looked to his story, my hope is that it's given you hope for your story right now. And so today we're talking about the question of, what do we do when the dream that we have dies? Or put it this way, what do you do when you lose sight of the dream that God has given you? What do you do when you lose sight of the dream that God has given you? All of us at every season of our life, whether you've been following Jesus for a long time or this whole idea of trusting Him with your life and your story is still new to you, or even if you have yet to make the decision to follow Jesus, there's something about your life, there's a dream that you have, there's a hope that you have, there's a desire and a picture for the future that you have somewhere in your mind that I believe, whether you admit it or not, is actually given to us from God. He actually says in His Word that He gives us visions and dreams just like Joseph had for the future. Now, they might not be as specific as Joseph's, and they might not cause as much sibling rivalry as his did in his life. Let's hope for you. But all of us have these hopes, these dreams, these pictures of a future desired reality. And yet for many of us, in seasons like this, in circumstances that are challenging, we can lose sight of that dream. We can lose sight of the dream for our kids that we've had when they've been all up in our business for the last 3 months at home. We can lose sight of our dream for our relationships, for our marriage, or our relationship with our roommates, or our relationship with our friends, as social distancing has either pushed us apart or slammed us together for different ways throughout the last few months. We can lose sight of our financial dreams as the stock market goes up and down and then back up again, but we're not sure how much we can trust it. As we can lose out on the security of jobs or the ability to spend money the way that we had thought. We can lose sight of our dreams for our soul and our spiritual growth, as church is something that used to be like something that we would engage with, even if it was sporadically, now is in a whole new format. And as we phase into new realities of reopening, what is that going to look like for us? We can have all of these spaces in our life where the dreams that we had, we can lose sight of them. And so what do you do when you lose sight of the dream that God has given you? And it really brings up other questions of, do we believe that God actually uses everyday ordinary people like you and me to actually change the world, to accomplish things, to make a difference? Do you actually believe that God can use everyday ordinary circumstances to change and direct your life? We've seen over the last few weeks how, as everyday ordinary folks take to the streets around racial injustice in our country, that things actually can change, that you have spent more and more time at home over these last few months, and it has changed you. We've had new conversations that we've engaged in as a community, as a society, and even as individuals when it comes to how do we make sense of all that's happening in our hearts and our souls around connection and community and people. And for many of us, this idea of disillusion really plays into a lot of those realities that we find ourselves in, because so much has changed. And when things change, we can get disillusioned and want to reach back for the way things were. And this is actually something that God actually can use in our life in the midst of that frustrating desire for things to go back to the way they were, or things to kind of change from the challenge or the pain that we're in. And we often lose sight of our dreams when our experiences don't line up with our expectations. That's usually the context in which we can find ourselves being disillusioned. We lose sight of the dreams that God has given us, that we had for ourselves or for our life or our relationships, when our experiences don't line up with our expectations. We expected something and we experience something different. We often can find ourselves just stopping and not knowing what to do next, getting stuck, or even feeling paralyzed in our own life, and even with God when the context is unexpected. I know for me, there was a time when we were walking with our kids and we walked to the playground near our house. And this was like the first week of quarantine, where we were thinking, oh, we'll just go get outside and we'll play on the playground. And all of a sudden the playground was closed. And you would have thought that the look on our three kids' faces, at least the older two, Selah, who's 5, and Leighton, who's 3.5, that we would have just taken all of their toys away and moved to a far off country where there was nothing for them to do. Instantly, I'm bored, I'm angry, and all of a sudden their expectation, we had gotten in the stroller, they had gotten on their scooters, we had walked down the street to the playground by our house, and they had very much clear expectations that they were going to get time to play. And you know what? We needed them to get some energy out. And then there wasn't the opportunity to do that. We couldn't do that. And in small scenarios like that, what it unearths for us is how well we do with interruptions or letdowns or disappointments. And it unearths something for us. And when it comes to our life with God, right, is that actually many of the best gifts that God gives us in our life often come wrapped in sandpaper. Many of the best gifts that God gives you and God gives me in our life come wrapped in sandpaper. They're not have a pretty bow on top. They're not even alluring in their presentation. Often there's a challenge, there's some frustration, and even kind of hurts a little bit sometimes for us to open the gift that God has for us to really grow us. The best gifts God gives us often come wrapped in sandpaper, and this is the gift of disillusion. And this was the story of Joseph's life. That all throughout his story, when things got good, there was something else coming around the corner. When he thought he was doing the right thing and everything was going his way, all of a sudden the floor drops out. And so we're going to pick up his story actually in Genesis chapter 40. And this point is it's a couple kind of chapters into his story where he is now in prison. He had been, the favored son of his father. He had gotten the robe of many colors. If you've seen the Broadway musical and Donny Osmond, it's that story. And then his brothers get jealous. While he's out there to bring them some food, they attack him and throw him in a pit. They're gonna kill him, but they decide to only sell him into slavery. Thanks so much, bro. They sell him to, some passing slave traders who sell him to Potiphar in Egypt, who's a very powerful and wealthy person there in Egypt. Everything's going well. He actually gets promoted to be the keeper of Potiphar's house. And then Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him, and he says no. She lies about it, and Joseph finds himself thrown in prison, wrongly and falsely accused for doing the right thing, but being accused of doing the wrong thing. And he's in there in prison, and he's in prison for years, waiting, frustrated, unfairly, imprisoned yet again. And he actually leads so well and is so clearly God is with him in prison that he's actually placed by the warden to be second in charge of the prison. He's actually in charge of other prisoners. And so we pick up this story in Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 1. If you have a copy of the scriptures, you can follow along. If not, it'll be up on the screen. But actually it says this, that sometime later, again, Joseph's in prison, Pharaoh's chief cupbearer and chief baker offended their master. Pharaoh became angry with these two officials, and he puts them in the same prison where Joseph was, in the palace of the captain of the guard. And so they remained in prison for quite some time, and the captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, who looked after them. So Joseph finds himself now watching over these two high-ranking officials, palace, employees, people that were really close to Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and he's now their, overseer in prison. And while they're in prison, it continues, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker each had a dream one night, and each dream had its own meaning. So again, Joseph has this ability to be given dreams, and we find out here can also interpret dreams. And he says to them the next morning, when he noticed that they both looked upset, he asked them, "Why do you look so worried today?" And they replied, "We both had dreams last night, but no one can tell us what they mean." So obviously they had woken up from their dream, and they had kind of talked amongst their, fellow prisoners in the cell next to them, and you figure out something to talk about. And he talked about their dream, and he said, "What do you think this means?" And nobody could give them an answer. Now, in that context, the ability to interpret dreams was actually highly sought after, and that was a kind of superstitious religious way that they had engaged with how to know what is coming in the future. And so, Joseph decides to ask them this question, why are you so sad? And they tell him that, hey, we had these dreams, but no one can tell us what they really mean and what they're about. And listen to Joseph's response. Again, we alluded to this last week about his maturing over the last few years of his challenging life. Joseph replied, "Interpreting dreams is God's business. So go ahead and tell me your dreams, and I will ask my God to reveal what they mean." So again, even in the moment, Joseph is deflecting the glory to God. And so the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream first. He says, "In my dream," he said, "I saw a grapevine in front of me, and the vines had 3 branches that began to bud and blossom and soon produced clusters of grapes." So he has a time-lapse dream, right? "I was holding Pharaoh's wine cup in my hand, and so I took a cluster of grapes and squeezed the juice into the cup. Then I placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. "You must really miss your job." No, just kidding, right? He says, "This is what the dream means," Joseph said. 3 branches represent 3 days from now. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift you up and restore you to your former position as his chief cupbearer." And then he adds this, "And please remember me and do me a favor when things go well for you. Mention me to Pharaoh so that he may let me out of this place, for I was kidnapped from my homeland, the land of the Hebrews, and now I'm here in prison, but I did nothing to deserve it." So see, Joseph reflects on his challenging scenario, on his story, on his situation, and says, hey, when you get out, remember me. Remember that I'm helping you out, and will you help me out as well? Now the chief baker is listening to this, and he gets excited because he hears that Joseph has told the cupbearer, hey, your dream means you're about to get your old job back in 3 days. You're getting out of prison. You're going to be restored back to a very prominent place in the palace. And so he pipes up. He says to Joseph, ooh, I had a dream too, right? He wants to get on the bandwagon. He says, in my dream, there were 3 baskets of beautiful white pastries stacked on my head. The top basket contains all kinds of pastries for the Pharaoh, but the birds came and ate them from the basket on my head. And you can just see him like eyes open, ready to hear, can't wait. My dream is going to be good too, right? This is what the dream means, Joseph tells him. The 3 baskets also represent 3 days. Within 3 days from now, Pharaoh will lift you up and actually impale your body on a pole. Then the birds will come and peck away at your flesh. This is what the dream means. Bum, 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 right? Total record scratch in that moment. And we've all had this moment, right, where we had this picture of what we think, we're hoping this dream is going to mean something like this, and then we find out it doesn't turn out the way we had thought. We find out it means something challenging is going to happen. Pharaoh's birthday came 3 days later. He had a banquet prepared for all his officials and staff. He summoned his chief cupbearer and chief baker to join them out of prison. They joined the other officials, and he then restored the chief cupbearer to his former position so he could once again hand Pharaoh his cup. But Pharaoh impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had predicted when he interpreted his dream. Pharaoh's chief cupbearer, however, forgot all about Joseph, never giving him another thought. So he gets restored to his position. He's back in employment. He's out of prison and back in the palace. And he forgets the person that helped him out. And so once again, Joseph is waiting, unknowing how long this is going to take, thinking, sure enough, this guy is going to remember that I interpreted his dream and let him know that he's getting out of prison and going to be back in his position of honor. Surely he will remember me. And he doesn't. And Joseph finds himself waiting. And so here's the thing about dreams when it comes to God, is that we all have dreams for ourselves, for our life, our finances, our relationships, for our spiritual growth, for our future, for our kids, our family. We all have dreams. Oftentimes those dreams can have 100 million aspects to them. We all have dreams. Oftentimes our dreams have all different aspects to them. Some of them are really about ourselves. If we're honest, they're kind of selfish and focus on what's in it for me. But many times our dreams really represent good things and flourishing for our community, our family. They have beauty attached for them outside of ourselves. Yet all of our dreams have the same thing in common. When we have a picture of the future that we desire, we get really attached to what that's going to look like. We can get really attached to it turning out exactly as we had envisioned it. We can, as we talked about last week, attach our hope to the vision rather than the vision giver. And so for many of us, right, even though we can believe that God knows our full potential and that God is guiding us towards the best version of ourselves all the time, we can forget that actually God is more interested in you reaching your full potential than you are. And yet God has many different tools to shape us into the person He's created us to be. Many different tools. Some of the tools we are aware of, some of them we're not. Some of the tools we're hopeful that He'll use, and others are ones that we hope He'll skip over. But God has many different tools, and God is never in a hurry. And this can actually be frustrating to us. And yet even in those spaces of frustration with how long it takes, God can actually be developing patience in us. God delights when we take steps and remain in rhythm with Him, and God is compassionate when we fall out and go after our own way. God desires for us to be the person that He thought up when He created us and grow to continually more and more be in rhythm with Him. And sometimes that means we walk through circumstances that we would never choose. Sometimes that means that our expectations and our experience will not line up. And we can think in that moment, we must have missed it. We must have gotten out of step with God. We must actually have maybe offended God, or that God has left us, or that God doesn't actually care. And yet what we see from the life of Joseph, what I hope we kind of bring into and receive into our own story and our own circumstances, even here and now, is that actually just because our circumstances aren't going well, that doesn't mean that God is far off. That actually, even when we find ourselves in positions of pain, that might be a way that God is trying to bring us back into alignment, or actually develop within us something that is in alignment with who He's created you to be. Years ago, C.S. Lewis writes about this in The Problem of Pain, where he describes his life very similar to ours. You know, as most of us live a pretty comfortable life and things go along as we expect for most of the time. And he says that when something comes up, whether it's a diagnosis or even just a bad headline on the news that kind of shocks us out of this comatose reality that we find ourselves in, he writes this. He says, "At first I'm overwhelmed, and all my little happinesses look like broken toys on the floor. And then slowly and reluctantly, bit by bit, I try to bring myself into the frame of mind that I actually should have been in all along. I remind myself that those toys were actually never meant to possess my heart." These toys he's referring to could be our outward appearance, or the car we drive, or the vision for the summer vacation that we had in mind. It could be our net worth, our 401k, or the opinion of a coworker that they hold about us. It could be our relational status, or how well our kids behave. All of these things in our life that we attach our value to and find our identity, and C.S. Lewis refers to them as broken toys on the floor. That my true good is in another world, and my only real treasure is Christ. But then he writes, which is so true about me, and I'm sure it's true about you as well. But then the moment that the threat is withdrawn, the moment that the pain goes away, the moment that things get back to normal, my whole nature leaps back to those toys. I mean, this is the threat that we all find ourselves facing in our disillusion as we begin to creep back towards normalcy. Right, as things begin to open up, as more and more opportunities are yet available again to us to spend our time and our attention and our resources, as we kind of drift back into a new normal. It might be different than before, but it feels much more familiar if we're honest, that we can forget perhaps the things that God stripped away, the patterns that he revealed that we had gotten lost in financially, relationally, with our time, that quarantine actually go, wow, that's a bad pattern. I want to shift that. I want to adjust that. That's a financial pattern that I need to kind of get out of. That's a relational, circumstance that actually this, stay-at-home order has freed me from. Whatever it might be, that as we kind of drift back into normal, slowly but surely, we can drift back to finding our identity, our value in these toys that were never meant to possess our heart. And this is what we see in the life of Joseph, that repeatedly over and over again, as threat, as pain, as challenging circumstances, as unfair accusations show up in his life, we notice that in every moment, whether challenging or blessing, he seems to be very aware, growing along the journey, that God is with him. That God is the one that is giving him the ability to interpret dreams, to be there for others, to gain leadership positions, even in prison. And so my wonder for us today, as we face this new reality, is what are the toys that you are tempted to go back to? What are the things in my life that I'm tempted to go back to find my value in? Because if we're honest, those can be much easier to hold on to than actually the gift of disillusion that God wants to give us, because that gift may be wrapped in sandpaper. See, there's this concept called cognitive dissonance, right? This idea of the things that we thought were supposed to go a certain way, when that gets out of whack, when that doesn't go the way that we thought, when our thinking wavelength, our expectations, the patterns that we thought life was supposed to take, when that gets interrupted, when it's not in rhythm, when it's out of sync, it's dissonant, we can begin to reassess the entire thing. And in fact, in moments of cognitive dissonance, while they're challenging, even frustrating, and even difficult and painful, those are the moments where our brains, psychologists have taught us this, right, are most open to new patterns and new ways of learning, and actually the greatest potential for transformation and growth. It's reflective of what the Apostle Paul writes when he says, let your life be transformed into a new way of living, right, by the renewing of your mind. Help us become more like Christ by changing the way that we think. And so in these spaces that we find ourselves, these moments of cognitive dissonance, we are actually more open to transformation and change and growth than other times when things actually go the way that we had hoped. We don't like it. I don't like it. You don't like it. But it actually might be the place that God has a gift for you. You've heard the phrase, don't let a good thing go to waste. Really, don't let a bad thing go to waste either. Right? That there is something that God has for us even in the challenging moments, even in our disillusion, that is actually a gift. That if we can get through the sandpaper wrapping, we can open it and find something beautiful inside for us and even for others. The Apostle Paul goes on and says this in Romans 8:28, a passage that maybe you're familiar with, where it says, we know, right? He's speaking to these believers that are facing challenging circumstances and persecution. We know that God actually causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. He doesn't say that everything is good, right? If he did, the Roman church would have written him off, right? Yeah, right, you don't know our circumstance. But Paul writes this to a church in Rome facing persecution while he himself is actually in prison. So he's not saying everything is good, because his situation wasn't good in and of itself. By face value, it was a bad situation, something he would not have picked or chosen. But God was using it to help people around him to hear about Jesus, that rather than speaking to hundreds, he was writing letters that had been passed on to thousands in his lifetime and tens of billions since his death. That we now, thousands of miles away and thousands of years later, would read his words and find hope in them, right? That we know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them. For God knew his people in advance, and he chose them to become like his son. Do you realize that? God knows you, the true you, in advance, and he is desiring for you to become more and more like Jesus. Not to become something entirely different, but to still be you, but look the most Jesus-like version of you. And the tools that he might be using these last few months might be tools of cognitive dissonance, might be tools of frustration, maybe even tools of anxiety or loneliness to find your true value and connection to Jesus. Might be using tools of financial tension or relational difficulty. He might be using tools of a change in job or fear of the future, that our God is so good that he can even use those things that we wish we would get rid of, that we might even describe as bad or as different than God or other than or away from the direction that God has planned for our life. God can even use those things, right? That he knew us in advance and chose us to be like his son, so that his son, meaning Jesus, would be the firstborn among all the brothers and sisters. And having chosen you, he called them to come to him. And having called them, he gave them right standing with him. And having given them right standing, he gave them his glory. In 4 short sentences, Paul describes the entire Christian life, the entire journey of following Jesus. It starts with God. God knew you. He chose you before you even would choose him. He called you to come to him. Right? He made a way. He made it possible. And through Jesus gave you right standing. You don't have to be afraid. You don't have to jump through religious hoops to be connected to God. That actually in the midst of challenging circumstances, you can anchor your hope in the reality that God knows you, chose you, and made a way for you. And that not only did he give you right standing, which would have been enough, but then it says he gives us his glory. It says you actually have a mission. You actually represent me in the world. You actually have my goodness surrounding you, even in the darkest circumstances that you find yourself in. So because of all that, Paul asked this rhetorical question. So what shall we say about all these wonderful things such as these? What do we say? If all that is true, regardless of where you find yourself, regardless of the circumstance that we are in this moment, regardless of the self-doubt or the voices coming from outside or the circumstances that don't line up with our expectations, what should we say about all these things because of what God has done for us? It says this: if God is for us, then who could ever be against us? If God is for us, who could ever be against us? If God is for you, who could be against you? If God is for you, what can your circumstance really do? If God is for you, what can economic turbulence really do? If God is for you, even a bad diagnosis and a disease, as challenging and painful as that might be, what threat does it actually hold against you? If God is for you, what do other people's opinions about you actually matter? When we click in and anchor ourselves to that truth, God is for us, we can say with confidence, who can actually be against us? And then he closes with this: since he did not, meaning God, did not even spare his own son, but gave Jesus up for us all, won't he give us all these other things? Won't he do what he's promised to do in your life? Won't he give you a gift even through a challenging circumstance? Isn't there something beautiful that God wants to bless you with, even in this moment, even if it's wrapped in sandpaper? Well, thanks so much for tuning in today. We're so glad that you joined us. In a moment, we're going to continue in our worship gathering to sing another song. But before we do that, I want to just invite you into another way that you can actually worship and participate in moving the mission of our church forward, and that's through your giving. We say this all the time around here, but we are never going to tell you what you should give, but we want to unapologetically ask you to talk to God about how you should invest financially in what he's doing here through Restoration Church. And so if this church is your home and God has moved and is moving in your life through the ministry of Restoration Church, we want to invite you to give joyfully and generously. If you're tuning in or someone sent you this link and this is kind of your first time, you're still checking out our church or checking out what it means to follow God, please don't feel any obligation to give. But for those of us that call Jesus our Savior and leader, and this is our church home, I want you to know that when you worship God through your giving, you not only tell him thank you for all the things that he's done in your life, but you actually participate and join him in the mission of restoration in our city and throughout the world. And there are people in San Diego right now that have food because of the ministry of this church. There are people in our city right now that are finding hope for their marriage or their broken relationship because of this church. There are kids growing up to experience what it means to have a life-giving relationship with Jesus because of your generosity. And so I just want you to know that when you give, it's not only an act of worship, but it actually furthers the mission of empowering all people to love and follow Jesus and helps San Diego look a little bit more like heaven. And so we just want to say thank you. You can do that a couple ways. If you're watching us on restorationchurchsd.com/live, immediately below this viewing window, You can scroll down and see all kinds of different resources that you already heard about, but there's also a place that you can click to give. If you're watching on any of our other platforms, YouTube, Facebook, you can go to restorationchurchsd.com/give, and you can set up online giving there. You can give one-time gift, or you can set up reoccurring giving. That's how my family and I love to do it, so that we actually can continue to be a part of the ongoing ministry of Restoration Church. If you want to use your cell phone, you can give via text. You can text any amount to the number 84321. It will bring up some suggestions, and then you can click Restoration Church as your giving destination and set up giving that way. Or you can mail a check here to our building. If you'd like to do it that way, you can give the analog way. It all still works the same. We're so grateful for all of you who choose to invest in the ministry of Restoration Church, especially in this time. As people in our city have unprecedented levels of need, we want to be even more generous, giving more than is required, not just because it actually honors God, but it actually represents Jesus to people that have yet to begin to follow him. And that's a way for us to participate in the work of God here in San Diego. So for those of you that are giving, thank you so much. I'd encourage you to do that. I would encourage you, for those of you that have yet to take that step, but this is your home, now is a great time to step in and join us. We not only need your participation, but we believe God will bless you in and through it. So let's give together with joy and generosity. And then in a moment, our creative team is going to lead us through one more song as we sing out to this God who is with us in every circumstance, even the ones that we didn't choose, and is actually working through those circumstances in your life and for your good. So let's sing together. Thanks for being here this morning.